They say that practice makes perfect. And I don't think there's any evidence better for that than just how good the media is at using emotions to manipulate the public. Now, you don't just think that the big oligarchs at the top of society, you don't just think that they spend billions of dollars backing politicians on the left and the right of the political spectrum, and billions of dollars controlling politicians through lobbyists, just to let the media expose how corrupt their politicians are. I mean, did you think that? Of course not. So the same oligarchs that spend all that money buying off politicians, well, they also own the corporate mainstream media. And these big oligarchs are globalist, and that's why I call it the globalist media. And we have this illusion of choice, right, in the media. But the truth is that 5 or 6 corporations control 90% of the mainstream media. Choice is an illusion. It's not real. And if it is the media's job to protect the politicians, who I think we all know are lying probably 90% of the time, how should they go about doing that? Well, I'll tell you how they do that. Through the use of emotions. They use emotions to get people to reject factual information and reject logical thought processes. Now, there's so many examples of this. But the best examples are how they get the public to support wars. In the 1990s, they wanted the public to support the Gulf War. So what they did was they ran a story that Iraqi soldiers were taking newborn babies out of incubators and leaving them to die. Now, this wasn't really happening, but that didn't matter. It was enough to get the American public to support an American war of aggression. And we see this time and time again. Look at the Stoneman Douglas High School shooting. After the shooting, which was tragic, the mainstream media waged a massive propaganda campaign. The globalist leftist media. What do they want? Gun control. Now, you know it was propaganda because there were students that came out of that high school who argued afterwards that if the teachers were armed, the shooting could have been prevented. But those students were deplatformed, and the students who pushed for gun control were provided platforms by the globalist, leftist, corporate mainstream media. So the media rolled out Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg and said, basically the argument was, if you don't support common sense gun control, then you support the murder of children. Well, if the gun control was common sense, the media wouldn't have to invoke the emotion of dead children to get people to support the gun control. They know the gun control is just the opposite of common sense. So they have to use emotions to manipulate people. Because using common sense, one could quickly figure out that the nature of being a criminal means you don't follow the law. And if you're going to shoot up a high school of a bunch of students, then you're certainly not going to follow a law that says you can't have the gun in the first place. Gun control disarms law-abiding citizens and gives a monopoly over the use of force to criminals. If we were using common sense, we'd say, well, we know in just the last 100+ years, over 200 million people have been killed by their own governments, including the United States of America. Just look at the Trail of Tears, look at the Wounded Knee Massacre, in which 300 Native American men, women, and children were killed by the American military. So using common sense, we'd say, okay, we don't want the government to have a monopoly over weaponry. That's not common sense at all. And that's why they invoke emotions to get people to ignore facts and ignore logic. And now we're seeing the same thing over the last week take place at the American southern border. The media arguing or spreading the propaganda, President Trump is separating children from their parents. And I found it very interesting because I saw that Barack Obama released a statement about how terrible this is, and I saw MSNBC tweet about it, so I looked at the comments, and everyone in the comments section was saying how great Obama is and how evil Trump is, and I wrote to them, I don't know what's sadder, that the media banks on you not figuring out that Obama carried out the same policy as Trump, or you not actually being able to figure out that Obama also separated children from their parents. And the media banks on people being so blinded by these emotions. I mean, if you break down what's happening at the border, you would know that most of the children who arrive at the border aren't arriving with their parents. They're arriving with smugglers, human traffickers. They could be victims of prostitution rings. The drug cartels use the children to help them get over the border because there's less of a chance that they'll be arrested and more of a chance that they'll be deported with the children. So the children aren't necessarily arriving with their parents. So it's hard to say, okay, just leave them with the parents. Well, they might be with pedophiles. In fact, in 2014, the New York Times reported that a pedophile ring was broken up, and they discovered that the children that were victims of this pedophile ring were actually handed to the pedophile ring from federal immigration authorities who believed the pedophiles to be their parents. So it's not as simple as, oh, don't separate the children from the parents. First, you have to confirm who the parents actually are. If you want to deport the children, you have to confirm where they actually come from in the first place. Then you have to have deterrence from people attempting to come back into the country. So if you're granting leniency, saying, okay, you try to get into the country one time, we won't put you in prison, we'll just deport you. Well, that requires a trial, which takes time. This way there's a record, because otherwise you get situations like Kate Steinle, where someone who has been deported 8 times kills an American citizen. That's not good for American children. Well, if you had criminally prosecuted this person, we could have made sure that that person was in jail. Kate Steinle would still be alive. But people are blind to these facts because they are controlled through propaganda. And the media preys on the weak-minded who can be controlled through this emotion. And you've seen that today. You saw that with Peter Fonda. I believe he's related to Jane Fonda. I don't know. But Peter Fonda, apparently he's an actor, tweeted out that Barron Trump should be kidnapped and left in a cage with pedophiles. Talk about being controlled by emotions, that you would have that much hatred for a child. You see Antifa doxing members of ICE, letting people know their addresses so that presumably their families could be attacked. Imagine having so much hatred in your heart. We saw another man arrested for threatening to kill the family of a congressman. Imagine having so much hatred in your heart. But this is what the media creates by using emotions and children as propaganda. And it's very ironic because the very people they're mobilizing that do think that Trump is Hitler and that they're fighting against actual fascists don't realize that the propaganda being used is actually turning them into the fascist, because the propaganda is dehumanizing people who disagree with them politically, which allows them to justify committing violence in their minds. And this is the same type of thing that was done in Nazi Germany. The people on the left just don't realize that they're the ones being made into the Nazis. Everything is a psychological operation. And people who defend liberty and people on the right, they don't use emotions effectively in the same way. We attempt to fight back with factual information, but in a world where people are so controlled by emotions, often facts don't matter, as you can see with what's going on at the American southern border. But just imagine if people on the right, if liberty lovers, used emotions in the same way. Imagine if for the last 8 years, instead of just criticizing Obama's open borders, instead of criticizing open borders in Europe, people on the right wing invoked the emotions of children that are victims of human sex trafficking as a result of these open borders. If we just showed pictures of children on milk cartons, say, this is little Johnny, or little Diablo, and he was trafficked from El Salvador across the American southern border. When authorities found little Diablo, they had found out that he had been violently raped by groups of men who had also crossed the American southern border, sodomized with a stick until the point of death, and you showed his family hysterically crying. Well, the open borders, they are what makes this human trafficking possible, all across Europe, all across the American southern border, and as a result, hundreds and thousands of young children have been victims of pedophilia and have been murdered. Imagine if in Chicago every day we put on TV the mothers of black children who have been murdered through black-on-black gang violence and just showed them crying every day and said, why won't the Democrats change their policies? Why do people keep dying under their policies? But we don't do that, so people are blinded to the facts. And people think that, mainly people on the left, think that there's gangs of white people hunting black people. But if you just look at statistics and facts, you know that a white person is much more statistically likely to be physically attacked by a black person, to have a violent crime committed against them by a black person, than a black person is to have a violent crime committed on them by a white person. But the emotions blind people. Imagine for the topic of abortions, if every day on the news you saw a 27-year-old mother hysterically crying that she was manipulated, that she didn't know how psychologically damaging it would be to her to abort what would have been her now 4-year-old child. And she's hysterically crying, and the news reporter sitting there talking to her about, tell us the things you would have done with your child had he been born. What were you going to name him? Imagine the emotions of that. Imagine when it came to higher taxes. You interviewed middle-class mothers who had just had their houses foreclosed because their taxes went up so much that they could no longer pay their mortgage. And you have young mothers sitting there with their children, looking impoverished, talking about how the taxes led them to losing their home. Imagine how the emotions would manipulate the public the other way. But people on the right, we know the facts are on our side, so we try to fight with the facts, but we get beat down with emotions, and the left and the globalist leftist media mobilizes these radicalized, hateful leftists because the propaganda, the emotion, using children often is used to dehumanize people who just want equality under the law, who just want the government out of our lives. And I think it's time we start fighting back with some emotions. But the problem is, when the right attempts to use these emotions, if they did, it wouldn't matter because the mainstream media, they would never play it. Just like the media won't report honestly now about what happened with human trafficking under Obama, and even that Obama separated children from their families. I mean, when this whole thing jumped off, it jumped off with the media showing a picture of a child in a cage. But as it turned out, the picture was from 2014 under Obama, and they were trying to nail Trump with it. But the media would never allow these type of emotions to be used because the media is pushing a left-wing globalist agenda. And until we can fight back with emotions and get the people to see this, then more and more people are going to be radicalized. And if we continue to see this, we're going to see the violence of the left ramp up more and more. I mean, I think it's a running joke in the Make America Great Again community that the media during the election tried to make Trump supporters look like the violent ones as they ignored all the leftist violence. In fact, the media didn't report that Hillary Clinton and the DNC had paid mentally ill people to show up at Trump rallies and incite violence. If they reported that one truth, that one fact, it would have changed the entire emotional landscape of the entire situation. But it's a running joke among Trump supporters that everyone damn well knew that as a Trump supporter, you had to be very careful wearing a Make America Great Again hat, putting a bumper sticker on your car that showed you supported Trump, because the left had been mobilized into violence against Trump supporters because Trump supporters had been so effectively dehumanized through the use of emotions by the mainstream media, by calling Trump supporters racist, by calling Trump supporters xenophobic. Everything is made backwards by the media, and people are manipulated for emotions. But just imagine for 1 second if emotions were used the other way on the topic of immigration, on the topic of abortions, on the topic of taxation. Well, the media might just get a taste of their own manipulative ways.